Dorothy Ann Hargrove here. Even now, I can still smell the jasmine drifting through that old porch swing screen, though it's been 54 years since that humid summer night in Little Rock when everything changed. I was only 20 then, a fresh-faced nurse in a crisp white cap, proud to be helping folks. Yet tonight, as I cradle this cooling cup of tea, I feel that same ache stirring in my chest. It's as if the past has reached out to tap me on the shoulder, whispering, "Remember, child. Don't you dare forget." I close my eyes and I'm 15 again, barefoot on the back steps, listening to cicadas humming like distant church hymns, the air thick with honeysuckle and the faint metallic tang of rain rolling in. That memory hums in my bones. Jimmy, bless his heart, was laughing under the porch light as he shook water from his shoes. I was swooning over his crooked grin, that eager spark in his eyes. Walter sat nearby, a quiet presence, taking in every detail with his watchful green eyes, as if he belonged in every corner of our world. I didn't question it then. I was young and in love, and I simply believed the world was made of good intentions and steadfast devotion. 54 years have passed, and though these bones have grown older, I still carry that night within me. I felt the weight of it in moments both grand and ordinary. A glance Walter cast when I told him how blessed I felt. The way I'd pause over a faded wedding photograph, Jimmy in his borrowed suit, me clutching a wildflower bouquet, my thumb tracing the edge of a yellowing Polaroid. Each time, my heart would tighten, and I'd tell myself it was nothing more than sorrow and joy tangled over the years. But tonight I cannot ignore it any longer. The lantern's glow flickers across the yard, and in the shifting shadows, I swear I see Jimmy's face, reminding me why this story still won't let me rest. It isn't simply about betrayal or an accident. It's about how time can soothe the heart until it forgets to question the quietest moments. It's about the breath you hold when someone you trust more than life itself carries a secret darker than any midnight. I think back to the morning after his funeral, the gray church lawn, Mother's arms around me as she sobbed, Daddy staring at the dusty ground. All the neighbors dropped off casseroles and sandwiches, their pity warm and heavy. Walter was there too, coal buckets in hand, sweeping magnolia petals from the yard. He said softly, "God has a plan." I clung to those words, even as a storm of doubt raged inside me. Over the years, I buried that doubt beneath layers of faith and routine, Sunday services, children's laughter in the hallway, porch swings, and iced tea in mason jars. I believed I'd found peace. Yet something in the hush of night kept whispering that I was missing the truth. The flicker of hesitation in Walter's gaze when he spoke of Jimmy's accident, the way he lingered by the car before the coroner arrived, small details I dismissed as echoes of grief. Tonight, though, I feel those echoes rising. My tea has grown cold, but I do not mind. I sit a little straighter on this old swing, the wood worn smooth by decades of visits, and I vow to speak this story aloud at last. By the time I finish, you will understand why the weight of a single letter, written long ago and sealed private, became the heaviest burden I have ever carried. This memory has waited 50 years for its voice, and it will not stay bottled up any longer. I was only 5 years old the first time I truly felt at home in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the summer cicadas droned like a gentle hymn against our back porch, and the church bells chimed in harmony each Sunday morning. Our little clapboard house sat on a quiet, dusty lane shaded by magnolia trees whose blossoms drifted down like soft white confetti whenever a breeze swept through. I can still taste the sweat and earth beneath my bare feet as I chased fireflies past our white picket fence in my favorite blue sundress, the hem frayed from who knows how many adventures, and my braids tied with a ribbon that Mother insisted matched my eyes. Breakfast smelled of sizzling bacon and rosemary biscuits fresh from Grandma's cast-iron skillet, and she hummed an old hymn while she cooked, her lined face glowing in the early light. Daddy's hands, calloused and strong from working the rail yards, always smelled faintly of grease and black coffee, and he would hoist me high on his shoulders so I could watch the freight trains roll by, thundering, majestic, untouchable, and dream that someday I might travel just as far. In those days, I believed in the promise of a neighbor's laugh over the fence, in the safety of a mother's embrace, and in the power of a simple wave to melt what worries might remain. I believed that every goodbye carried a promise of return, and that kindness was the rarest and most priceless treasure one could own. I fell asleep most nights pressed against mother's side, listening to the gentle thump of her heart, and vowed in that quiet darkness that I would carry love into every corner of my future life. I thought that a life devoted to mending hurts, just like Sister Mary Agnes did at St. Vincent's Hospital, would be the highest calling a woman could choose, and I could almost see myself in her crisp white uniform, caring for those who needed a gentle hand and a listening ear. Turning 16 brought a new rhythm to my days, a creaking of the world's doors as they opened just a little wider. I became a candy striper at our local hospital, pinning on that starched cap and threading through sterile corridors where the smell of antiseptic mixed oddly with lilies from the chapel. I carried daisies to patients' beds and squeezed calloused hands that trembled with gratitude. I watched weary families pray beside tablets of medicine and whispered words of comfort I barely understood myself. Each time someone smiled gratefully and said, "Thank you, dear," I felt my heart grow 3 sizes with the knowledge that healing was more than medicine. It was the gentle presence of kindness taken up residence in your very soul. I would return home exhausted, rest my head on the front steps, and marvel at the blessing of being young enough to learn what mattered before heartbreak touched my life. By the time I donned my white dress and golden hair spilled over my shoulders as a bride-to-be, I was stitched together from those childhood dreams of service, faith, and unwavering hope. I believed that good people stayed good, that doors opened when you knocked with a prayer, and that someday all my pieces would fit together perfectly into the woman I was becoming. Little did I know that beneath those magnolia blooms and beside those steady skillet breakfasts, a darker turn awaited, a secret that would unravel the very seams of every belief I'd held dear. But in that soft, warm conviction, I took my first steps toward a life I could never have imagined, convinced that love was as unbreakable as the bonds of family, and that if you treated a person's heart with gentleness, it would never shatter. Those memories remain the foundation of who I am, a woman who knows that innocence is fragile, that kindness is powerful, and that the simplest faith can carry us through even the shadowed passages of our lives. It was a warm spring evening in 1970 when my life took that first, unforgettable turn. I just finished my shift as a candy striper at St. Vincent's Hospital, still wearing my crisp white cap, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back with a pale blue ribbon my mother had tied that morning. The air outside smelled of honeysuckle and fresh-turned earth from the garden down the block, and I was hurrying past Mr. Beasley's mailbox when I heard laughter, rich and easy, drifting across the sidewalk. I looked up, and there he stood, James "Jimmy" Hargrove, leaning against the old oak fence, holding 2 lemonade cups, one in each hand, his dark hair curling just above his collar. He tipped his head as though he'd somehow been waiting just for me. My heart gave a little jolt, like a bird flapping its wings too hard, though I couldn't have told you then why. My mother would later say I went as pale as the lace on my cap, but at that moment I only knew the world had shifted on its axis. Jimmy offered me one of those lemonade glasses, his eyes sparkling like the Mississippian sunlight, and I took it, feeling the icy sweetness trickle down my throat and something warmer bloom in my chest. He introduced himself, Jimmy Hargrove, serviceman home for a week's leave, and I, Dorothy Ann Hargrove, simply Dorothy and candy striper and dreamer. His voice was warm and steady, like Sunday morning sermons, and I found myself smiling before I could stop. Behind me, I heard the soft patter of shoes on pavement and turned to see my younger sister, Betty Lou, peeking around the corner of the fence with that mischievous grin she'd inherited from our father. "Dorothy Ann," she whispered later, "you looked like you'd seen an angel." I shrugged it off, saying I was just tired from work, though inside my stomach was doing somersaults I'd never felt before. Even Mrs. Carter, our neighbor who always knitted at dusk, paused her needles and watched from her front porch, shaking her head in that knowing way older folks have when they spot young love budding on their street. Over the next few days, Jimmy found every excuse to pass by the hospital, asking about my shifts, telling me stories of his time overseas, and sharing small kindnesses, a hot cocoa on a chilly evening, a stray daisy he'd picked by the riverbank. The way he listened when I talked about wanting to heal people's hurts. I remember thinking, I can't explain why my heart beat so much faster every time he said my name, but I welcomed that quickening like a friend. It was as if the world had opened a secret door, and he was standing in the threshold, offering me a glimpse of something I'd only ever read about in storybooks. Jimmy wasn't just handsome, he was gentle. Once, when I complained of a headache after a long shift, he draped his jacket over my shoulders and whispered, "I promised I'd always protect you, even from the storm." In his presence, I felt braver than I'd ever felt alone, softer than a petal, and certain that kindness wasn't just the best treasure, it was the only one that mattered. Little did I know then, as I leaned my head against his shoulder on those hospital steps, watching the sun dip below the pines, that this meeting would set in motion a lifetime of joy and sorrow intertwined. That night, my dreams were sweet as sugarcane, and I believed with every fiber of my being that love, once it found you, would never let you go. Yet love, I would learn, carries its own hidden weight, and sometimes the very hands that hold us closest can shape the course of our destiny in ways we never could have imagined. I remember the morning after Jimmy's funeral as if it were painted in gray watercolors, everything muted, heavy with sorrow. The preacher's words still echoed in my ears while I stood on that dusty church lawn, clutching Walter's hand so tight my knuckles hurt. The sun was pale behind a veil of clouds, as though even the sky mourned with us. Outside, mourners whispered about brake failure and bad luck, but inside me a storm raged that I had no words to name. Mother wrapped her arms around me and wept into my hair, her perfume mingling with our tears. Daddy's shoulders shook beside her. He stared at the ground as if the earth itself had betrayed him. All I could think was that this shouldn't be happening, Jimmy shouldn't be gone. In the days that followed, my world tilted on its axis. The house felt cavernous without his laughter, and every empty chair, every silent window, reminded me of his absence. Neighbors left casseroles and platters of sandwiches on the front porch, their eyes brimming with pity. When they said, "We're here for you, Dorothy," I forced a small smile, even though my heart pounded with relief that someone was there and guilt that I could still breathe. Walter hovered at the edge of each gathering, steadfast, caring, his sorrow hidden behind calm eyes. He carried coal buckets to the porch, swept fallen magnolia petals from the yard, and brought me tea without fail at 3 o'clock each afternoon. I was grateful for his presence, but in the hush between us, I often caught a flicker of something unspoken in his gaze and turned away, ashamed that I couldn't bring myself to question what I feared I might discover. Rumors rippled through town, quiet murmurs at the general store, sotto voce conversations in the church pews about faults in the coroner's report and the possibility that a soldier's practiced hands might have recognized tampered brake lines. Mrs. Carter told her knitting circle that accidents don't always happen by chance, and one afternoon I saw the county clerk's deputy shoot a furtive glance at Walter before handing over Jimmy's death certificate. The air grew thick with suspicion, and I felt caught between loyalty to my husband's memory and fear that admitting doubts would dishonor him. I was terrified that looking too closely would unravel the world I had known, but staying silent felt like living a lie. Inside my chest, sorrow intertwined with something darker, anger that smoldered in silent waves I refused to ride. I had always believed in being the gentle, forgiving daughter, the devoted fiancée, the caring nurse. How could I admit that I closed my eyes at night and pictured the crash, imagining more than just faulty brakes? I awoke in sweat-soaked sheets, convinced I heard gravel grinding under unseen wheels. Mother would shake me awake and whisper that everything would be all right, but her words were as flimsy as tissue paper against the thunder echoing in my mind. No one asked if I wanted answers. Everyone around me wanted to shield me from pain, but their protection felt like a cage of silence, and I lacked the courage to break free. Through it all, Walter remained by my side, steady, gentle, insisting that grief should be met with faith. He placed his hand on my shoulder and reminded me that God had a plan and would guide us through. At first, his conviction comforted me. I believed faith could carry me over any chasm. Yet late at night, I'd sometimes find him standing in the shadows by the shed, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, and I trembled, uncertain if grief or guilt rooted him there. When the coroner's report was finally finalized and ruled Jimmy's death accidental, I was left clutching fragments of doubt I could neither form into answers nor simply discard. My soul felt like a quilt missing its central patch, beautiful yet incomplete. In the quiet hours, when cicadas hummed and moonlight traced silver paths across the floorboards, I realized life would never resume its old rhythm. The world had changed irrevocably, and so had I. A choice took shape in my mind: remain in the safety of a closure everyone insisted I had, or step into a truth that might shatter everything I thought I believed. I didn't fully understand then how profound that choice would be, but I knew it would chart the course of every tomorrow I would ever live. I remember the moment like a photograph frozen in time. July 1st, our 50th anniversary, the day that was supposed to be all roses and laughter. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, and I was standing by the faded rose-print sofa, holding an envelope in my trembling hand, its edges yellowed like something unearthed after a long winter. Walter stood across the room, polishing his cufflinks, unaware that the world I'd spent a lifetime building was about to fracture. I slid my thumbnail under the seal and felt my breath hitch, as if the air itself waited to escape. When I finally tore it open, a heavy silence fell, and I could almost hear the clock's ticking stop. Inside was a letter written in careful, looping script, words both tender and impossibly cruel. It wasn't an accident. I caught Jimmy's break lines. I couldn't bear to let the truth die with me. My hand went numb, and I tasted fear on my tongue. My heart thundered. How long had this been waiting? 50 years of sunrise kisses, bedtime prayers, watching our children grow, 50 years believing in the man who'd promised to protect me. The room tilted, and I gripped the arm of the sofa so hard my nails bed into the fabric. Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them back. Walter looked up, his face softening with the love I'd always known there. "Dorothy," he murmured, setting aside his cufflinks as if sensing a shift in the air. The letter slipped from my hand, fluttering to the floor. Walter stepped toward me, his brow furrowed, but I couldn't meet his eyes. In that heartbeat of betrayal, I realized I'd been living a careful lie, one he'd etched into every corner of our life together. Memories cascaded through my mind, the way he'd fixated on details of Jimmy's accident that no one else remembered, the tremor in his voice when he offered to mend Jimmy's car before the coroner arrived, the promise he'd whispered after the crash, "I'll always guard you, come what may." All those moments I'd folded away, convincing myself they were nothing more than grief's echoes. Now in my hand lay the truth, sharp as broken glass. A wave of sorrow washed over me, not just for Jimmy, whom I loved with a young woman's fierce devotion, but for the man I'd married in his place, whose silence had become my world. I felt the weight of every anniversary party, every shared sunset, condensed into a single confession. I realized I would never again hear Walter call me my love without tracing the blade of that betrayal. Loss rolled over me in tidal waves, loss of trust, loss of innocence, loss of the future I'd believed in. As the clock chimed its last echo, I stood very still, letting grief settle into my bones. Walter reached toward me, his eyes wide with something I didn't recognize, fear or maybe regret. But I stepped back and placed my palm over the letter on the floor. No apology, no plea could bridge the chasm he'd carved. My voice caught in my throat and I whispered, "You gave me 50 years of grief masquerading as grace." The world began to move again. The grandfather clock resumed its steady measure of time, but I was changed beyond measure. The chill of truth settled into my heart, and I knew I would never call him my love again. Though I spoke no further words that night, the silence between us roared louder than any confession. In that silence, I buried a part of myself, the part that believed in forever and walked away from a life built on lies, carrying only the fragile shards of what once felt whole. After that night, when the truth lay between us like broken glass, my days stretched on longer than any I'd ever known. The house felt hollow, each room haunted by memories I could no longer share with the man I once loved. Mornings began before dawn, with me slipping into my slippers and filling the kettle for tea, but the familiar sound of Walter's footsteps never followed. I missed the warmth of his hand at the small of my back, guiding me from room to room. Instead, there was only an emptiness, a yawning silence where our laughter had lived. I sat at the old oak breakfast table, staring into my teacup as though its surface might reveal the answers I dared not speak. I tried to read the Bible verses that had comforted me for decades, but the words swam on the page and faith felt distant, like the echo of a dream I could almost, but not quite recall. Neighbors still waved from their cars as they passed the swing on my front porch, but I stayed inside, watching the horizon through lace curtains, wondering if the sun would ever feel warm again. Dust motes danced in the morning light, each one reminding me that time moved on whether I was ready or not. For a time, I busied myself sorting through Jimmy's old letters from his service days, each envelope a fragile relic of the love I lost. I dusted the living room shelves until my fingers were raw and pruned the rose bushes Walter insisted on tending, even though he never spoke of them anymore. On Sundays, our children, grown with families of their own, called to check on me. Their voices were filled with gentle concern. "How are you, Mama?" they would ask, and for the first time I answered honestly. "I'm learning to live in the stillness," I told them, and in their quiet acceptance, I felt a spark of connection that outshone my own despair. Some afternoons, I would settle into the porch swing and let the cicadas hum their mournful song. I rocked slowly, letting the weight of my memories settle around me like the dust on the windowsill. I thought of Jimmy's bright laughter, the way it filled every corner of our home, and of Walter's hands, steady and caring, even when they had betrayed me. My heart ached for the life I had envisioned, 50 more years of shared mornings, Sunday dinners with grandchildren at my feet, growing old hand in hand. Instead, I was left with endless questions and a world that no longer felt safe to inhabit. Over time, something remarkable began to happen. I found small moments of peace where I least expected them. Walking down to the riverbank where Jimmy used to take me, I pressed my fingers into the soft mud and reminded myself that the earth sustained its secrets and its healing beneath the surface. In the garden, I planted daylilies and zinnias in bright colors that made me gasp at their beauty. Each bloom was a quiet promise that life still held surprises. I returned to the ladies' sewing circle, not to mend fabric, but to mend my own soul, stitch by careful stitch. When Mrs. Carter offered me her best tea cake and a seat beside her, I accepted, even though I could almost hear the town's whispers following me home. My faith, once as solid as rock, had cracked under the weight of betrayal, yet through those fissures, a new light began to shine. I took to reading poetry by the water's edge and discovered that words could cradle sorrow as tenderly as they could lift the spirit. I kept a journal filled with unsent letters, confessions of grief, flashes of anger, and, eventually, the soft glow of forgiveness. I never forgave Walter aloud, for such a forgiveness felt too grand and too private to voice. Instead, I forgave myself for believing too easily, for holding on too long, and for learning too slowly. In that act of self-compassion, I reclaimed a measure of strength I feared had been lost forever. Nights remained the hardest. Moonlight would filter through the curtains, painting silver ribbons on the hardwood floor. I'd lie awake, listening to the house breathe around me, and whisper to the darkness, "I am still here." In that quiet affirmation, I found proof that I had survived. Over the months and years that followed, the ache in my heart softened from a jagged wound into a quiet scar, always present, yet no longer defining me. I learned that loss could shape a new kind of life, that solitude could teach resilience, and that truth, once unearthed, could set me free in ways I never expected. Now, I sit in the same spot where I first read that dreadful letter, watching young mothers walk their children to school along our lane. The world moves forward with or without my consent, and I sit my tea crisp and cool, breathing in the jasmine and honeysuckle that still bloom unsolicited. My heart is quieter, but it still feels. I've traded a certain kind of innocence for a gentler wisdom, that grief and hope can coexist, that a woman can survive betrayal and still choose love, and that life, even on its hardest days, remains more than worthy of our tenderest care. In that knowledge, at last, I have found my peace. I didn't see it coming, this small moment that would crack open my world like dawn breaking through storm clouds. It was early September when I decided to join the community garden behind the church. For so long I'd tended old roses and dusty heirlooms in my own yard that I'd nearly forgotten how it felt to plant something brand new, something alive with promise. That crisp morning I found Mrs. Jenkins struggling with a row of drooping tomato plants, her back bent, her face pinched with concentration. Without thinking, I set down my watering can and stepped over. "Let me give you a hand," I said, and in that simple offer I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Together we straightened stakes, tied vines, and sprinkled fresh soil at the base of each plant. The sun warmed our shoulders, and I realized how healing it was to work side by side with another gardener, our hands moving in unison through rich, dark earth. Every handful of soil reminded me that life could grow again, even after being trampled by sorrow. Later, as I knelt to plant sunflower seeds of my own, I glanced down at my hands, calloused and strong, and thought, "You still have so much to give." That thought was like water to parched roots. I'd spent decades caring for others, my children, my patients, my neighbors, but I had long since forgotten that I, too, could learn and grow. Yet there, knee-deep in new beginnings, I felt a gentle stirring in my chest. A second chance, whispered by the breeze, beckoned me forward. Over the next few weeks, the garden became both my classroom and my sanctuary. I learned to coax beans up trellises, to recognize aphids before they took hold, to harvest basil at dawn when its fragrance was sweetest. Each task, though simple, served as a tangible reminder that actions, no matter how small, have the power to transform. When I carried baskets of ripe tomatoes and fragrant herbs back to my kitchen window, a quiet pride swelled in my heart, the pride of someone who had nurtured life from seed to harvest. One afternoon, I carried a basket of fresh basil to the local senior center, where the lunchroom hummed with conversation. I lingered by the door, uncertain, until a young volunteer named Marisol beckoned me over. "Dorothy, would you chop these peppers for the soup?" she asked, eyes bright. As I practiced careful, measured strokes with my old nursing knife, slicing red and green flesh, I realized I was bringing more than basil to the table. I was offering hope, connection, and proof that age could be a beginning, not a twilight. Marisol smiled. "You've got a good touch," she said. "You should teach a cooking class." My heart lurched at the thought, me teaching a class, but warmth spread through my chest, and I laughed at how wonderful and unlikely it sounded. Yet that possibility, instructing eager faces on soups and pastries, felt as natural as breathing. That evening I sat on my porch with a cup of chamomile tea, letting the cool air wash over me. For the first time in many moons, I allowed myself to imagine a future defined not by betrayal or loss, but by purpose and growth. I pictured myself greeting a room full of students, aprons tied and recipes in hand, sharing the skills I'd honed as a nurse, a gardener, and a storyteller. I felt my faith stir anew, not the blind faith of my youth, but a gentle faith in resilience and in the human capacity to begin again. The next day, I signed my name on the Senior Center bulletin board under volunteer instructors. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to remind me that even at 71, new meaning and fresh connections remained within reach. Sometimes it takes the simplest act, lending a hand in a garden, to remind us that hope, like a well-tended seed, can flourish in the most unexpected places. I sat in the late afternoon sun as it filtered through gauzy curtains, the letter that had shattered my world folded neatly on the coffee table before me. 50 years of laughter, tears, and whispered prayers lay tangled in that small piece of paper, but today I knew what I had to do. With a steady hand, I reached for the old wooden box where I'd stashed the mementos of my life: Jimmy's watch, Walter's cufflinks, scattered wedding snapshots, and lifted the lid. Tokens of love and betrayal lay together like misplaced puzzle pieces. For so long I'd carried that weight in silence, letting it shadow my every joy. But now, at 71, I felt something new stirring, the fierce conviction that my story belonged to me alone, and I would not let the past rob me of one more moment of peace. I slit the letter from its envelope and smoothed its creased surface, reading the words I'd read 1,000 times. I cut Jimmy's break lines. The ink was faded, but the meaning remained as sharp as ever. My hands trembled, and I braced myself for tears, but instead a quiet calm settled over me, an understanding that those words had done their damage long ago. Today, they would serve a different purpose, keys to unlocking the rest of my life. With deliberate grace, I carried the letter onto the back porch, where jasmine and honeysuckle climbed the trellis and bees hummed in the late summer warmth. I laid the letter on the stone bench and placed beside it a faded photograph of Jimmy in his uniform, smiling at me with unguarded joy. Breathing in the scent of blooming flowers, I let memories wash over me: our wedding day, our first Christmas, children's laughter ringing through the halls. I allowed myself the tender ache of those moments, then in one swift motion crumpled the letter into a tight ball. The paper crackled in my palm like dry leaves. I thought, "This is not who I am," and tossed the ball into the flower bed, where it landed among the petals of newly planted sunflowers. The paper wilted instantly, as if shame itself were absorbed by the earth. I lifted the photograph, smoothed its edges, and tucked it back into the box. As the sun dipped lower, tears slipped down my cheeks, tears of release, forgiveness, and acceptance. Not for Walter's betrayal, but for myself, for trusting too easily, for silencing my doubts, for letting anger erode my faith. In forgiving myself, I felt whole again. Rising from the bench, I brushed soil from my sleeves and carried the wooden box inside. I closed the lid with a soft click and slid it onto the highest shelf of my closet. I poured chamomile tea, stirred in honey, and settled into the window seat. Outside, the garden glowed in the last light, bees heading home. In that gentle dusk, I made a promise. Each morning I would choose to embrace the love that still warmed my bones, extend kindness even when I feared it, and live unburdened by what could have been. I whispered into the evening air, "I choose to live on. Without demands, without regret, simply onward." And in that quiet vow I found a certainty. This was my story, on my terms, and I would write the next chapters with an open heart. I've lived long enough to see how time can smooth the jagged edges of our sorrows while carving deep channels of memory into our hearts. In my youth, I believed kindness alone would guard me from harm, that faith and good intentions could keep life on its straight and narrow. I trusted easily, loved fiercely, and never paused to question sweetness when it was offered. But over the years I learned that truth has a stubborn way of revealing itself, often when we least expect it, sometimes through the very hands we hold. I once thought grief would shatter me forever, that a broken heart never mends. Yet here I am, cradling a quiet strength born not from easy days, but from the hardest ones I ever faced. Life's truest lessons aren't served up on a silver platter. They're chased in the dark, wrestled into the light, and worn like badges of honor on tired souls. What I've come to understand is this: our pain does not define us unless we let it. For decades I carried a secret heavier than any funeral wreath, tucking it away in silent corners of my mind, believing that silence would shield me. Instead, silence bred shadows, and those shadows grew until they threatened to swallow the light. It took 50 years for me to speak my truth, to admit that trust can be broken, and that forgiveness isn't about excusing wrongs, but about freeing ourselves from their grip. When I finally released that old letter into the earth, I felt the roots of my spirit settle back into the soil, ready to sprout new hope where sorrow once reigned. Perhaps the most honest wisdom I can share is that grief and gratitude can live side by side, and love can be reborn even after betrayal. We needn't wait for perfect conditions to bloom again. I spent too many seasons waiting for the world to feel safe, for the past to be rewritten, for a sign that everything would be okay. But life hands us no guarantees, only moments, one after another, waiting to be filled with meaning. What if, instead of waiting for wounds to heal on their own, we choose to tend them with compassion and courage? What if we whisper to our own hearts that it's safe to hope again, even when fear tugs at our sleeves? I think of the young faces I see now, wide-eyed and unburdened, stepping into a world with trust like a shield. If I could speak to them, I'd say, trust is precious and fragile. It must be earned, and it can be rebuilt when broken, with honesty, boundaries, and the quiet power of forgiveness. And to anyone listening, know this: your story does not end at the worst thing that ever happened to you. You have the right to write new chapters, to plant seeds of joy in the ashes of old regrets, to remind yourself that second chances aren't just for others, they're for you too. So perhaps now is the time to stop waiting for the perfect moment, the assurance of certainty, or the approval of anyone else. Maybe it's time to say the hard words out loud, to extend a hand when it terrifies you, to set down burdens you were never meant to carry forever. In doing so, you may discover, as I did, that the gentlest power lies in owning your truth, and that the deepest peace comes from living it fully. When we let the sun of understanding rise after a long night, we find our hearts are bigger, our spirits stronger, and our capacity for love more enduring than we ever imagined. Dorothy Ann Hargrove here, leaning into the soft evening light as fireflies begin their slow dance across the garden. We've walked together through my youth and my love, through sorrow and revelation, and now, standing at the edge of the story, I want you to know that it isn't just a tale of days gone by. It holds a mirror to the moments we live right now. When I gaze at the sunflowers I planted after shedding my grief, I see how they turn toward the sun each morning, trusting it to rise again no matter how dark the night. It makes me wonder about true love and its gentle insistence to find us, to come home even after years of silence. Sometimes I think I catch a glimmer in Walter's eyes at dusk, a flicker of recognition when he looks across the porch, as though some part of him remembers the promises we once held. Should true love return? Should it circle the world and come back wiser for its travels, brimming with stories to share? Or is love something we hold tightly only once, never to revisit again? I'm curious what you think. Have you ever felt the quiet echo of someone you once loved, as persistent as a sunset's glow? This isn't just my story of a 50-year secret or a sudden revelation. It's our story of holding on and letting go, of finding courage in stillness, and of trusting that even the smallest seed of hope can sprout in the unlikeliest soil. The past shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. Sometimes the most profound love stories are the ones we continue writing in the silent spaces of our hearts. As you close your eyes tonight, carry with you the promise of possibility, that no matter what you've faced, you can turn your face toward the light and let love find you once more. And perhaps, like me, you'll pause at a memory and wonder with a quiet smile, is it possible they remember me too? Sometimes I feel he still remembers, and maybe, just maybe, that spark is enough to guide us all back home.